FEMA's job has changed from disaster response to coronavirus relief. Their latest efforts as more states start to reopen. I'm Jesse Tenor in Washington, and all of that story coming up.
The decision to open several non-essential businesses in Georgia has the state split. I'm Kelly Meyer reporting from Washington what several 2020 Senate candidates have to say.
I'm Trevor Shirley in Washington, where lawmakers are closely watching Georgia reopen its economy today as other states make moves to do the same. I've got that story coming up.
Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey releases his plan to reopen the state's economy. I'm Basil John reporting in Washington what lawmakers think about the call to reopen.
I'm Morgan Wright in Washington. Coming up, how some House Democrats think the nation should go about reopening the economy.
I'm Alexandra Limon in Washington. Congress has already approved nearly $3 trillion in coronavirus relief aid. Now lawmakers are debating whether more is needed. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wonders if states should be allowed to file for bankruptcy instead.
I'm Raquel Martin in Washington. Democrats are calling for more federal oversight to ensure billions in small business loans are actually making it to small businesses. I'll have that full story coming up.
The decision to open several non-essential businesses on Friday has Georgia split, especially among its 2020 Senate candidates.
It is rolling the dice with human lives of our fellow Georgians for the governor to prematurely reopen.
Democratic candidate Sarah Riggs-Amico says Georgia isn't meeting the federal guidelines for having 14 consecutive days of declining cases.
I don't know that we've thought this through very carefully.
Teresa Tomlinson, another Democratic Senate candidate, says because businesses that chose to open up won't be eligible for federal aid, they'll be more at risk economically than if they just stayed closed. Governor Brian Kemp tweeted Thursday night he has the data to open shuttered businesses for limited operations. But Democratic Senate candidate John Ossoff says because of limited testing, the data isn't reliable.
It's risky to reopen the economy when we don't know the scope and the nature of the spread of the disease here in Georgia.
All three are running against incumbent Republican Senator David Perdue, who says he's for a gradual, phased approach. A statement from Perdue's spokeswoman Friday said, as a member of the president's task force, the senator is focused on helping all Georgians and Americans get through this crisis. He did not comment on any specifics of Governor Kemp's plan. Reporting in Washington, I'm Kelly Meyer.
Georgia hasn't met the CDC guidelines to reopen its economy, but today Republican Governor Brian Kemp eased most business restrictions statewide.
I think it's important that the decisions by elected officials are driven by the real facts on the ground, the health situation.
Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman wants that approach for his state. He's watching Georgia to see how citizens there respond.
I think they're going to care about what they perceive as the health situation. In other words, if they don't think it's safe, they're not going to go to the restaurants that are going to reopen in Georgia.
Indiana Senator Mike Braun prefers a targeted approach over a one-size-fits-all.
I think it's going to be different county by county within states and state by state across the country.
But some officials say testing still isn't widespread enough to get a true sense of the virus's reach, which Illinois Democratic Representative Sherry Bustos says is crucial.
If there's one thing that we have to make sure that we're getting right before we get back to normal in this country, is that we have the capacity to test.
But Braun argues state economies can't wait for testing to catch up.
But I don't believe we're going to be in a spot to where we can open the economy up based upon testing being everywhere, because I think it'll delay that.
He thinks a county's rate of infection should also be considered.
So we need to do it in a smart way that doesn't gamble in places where there's been a high incidence.
Reporting in Washington, I'm Trevor Shirley.
Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey has a plan to reopen Pennsylvania's economy.
I think it's time. I think we can do this safely, and that's what my plan is about.
The first phase opens businesses that can follow health and social distancing recommendations. The second phase would see restaurants, bars, and gyms reopen before entertainment venues in phase 3.
If a business in such a region or a county is able and willing to comply with CDC guidelines for keeping your workers and your customers safe, then I think that business ought to be able to reopen.
State and local officials will move to the next phase when counties see local hospital capacity is not at risk of being overwhelmed, there is space in hospitals if people do get sick, and if hospitals are willing to comply with basic protocols.
And if those three things are met, then I think you ought to be in business if you want to be. And I think people want to be.
Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf has a similar plan, but Democrats want the state to be careful.
What we're really worried about is severely overburdening our hospitals and our healthcare providers and our first responders.
Pennsylvania Representative Matt Cartwright is worried more cases could pop up, and Pennsylvania Representative Dwight Evans wants the state to closely follow CDC guidelines.
And I think we need to be very sensitive to how we approach this. That's why there was $25 billion added for testing.
Toomey says 2/3 of Pennsylvania already meets some specific criteria and can resume activities. Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin says the nation needs a unified approach to reopening.
If we follow this totally helter-skelter, disorganized path of reopening, we will thrust back quickly into further outbreaks of the epidemic.
Raskin says that's why his Reopen America Act is needed to reopen the country with steps supported by science and medical advice.
The only thing that we've got that has been able to establish a truce with the disease at this point is social distancing.
At the end of the day, the way we're going to control this is we're going to need to find out who tests positive, and who doesn't.
Massachusetts Congressman Jim McGovern and Vermont Congressman Peter Welch say increased testing is vital.
Self-isolation at first, but then the testing, the contact tracing, and the quarantining.
The legislation has more than 60 co-sponsors, but Republicans have yet to sign on to the plan.
It's going to take testing. It's going to take financial commitment.
New York Congressman Tom Reed has introduced a bipartisan bill of his own to reopen the nation and says the health and economic crises must be balanced.
If you don't couple it with the economic measures, you're just not getting the magnitude of the crisis and how deep it is.
Reporting in Washington, I'm Morgan Wright.
Even after approving an additional $480 billion in aid for small businesses, hospitals, and testing, lawmakers acknowledge it will be a long road to recover from the economic impact of the pandemic. State and local governments say they're still waiting for help, but Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says Congress needs to be cautious.
And in the meantime, also take a look at how much debt we racked up.
In a radio interview Wednesday, McConnell suggested that allowing states to file for bankruptcy would be better than borrowing more money at the federal level. States are losing huge sums of tax revenue needed to pay for police, fire, and other essential services.
And they are our heroes right now. So I don't know what Mitch McConnell is thinking, but that's totally irresponsible.
So far, Congress has approved nearly $3 trillion in aid.
And it's absolutely clear that more help is going to be needed with unemployment insurance.
New Mexico Representatives Ben Ray Lujan and Deb Haaland say people are in dire need.
We would like to see an influx to SNAP benefits.
Democrats also want more money for the post office and for expanding rural broadband so Americans can have access to telemedicine and telelearning now and if a second wave of COVID-19 cases arrives in the fall. In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
This is an historic response
For the first time in history, the coronavirus crisis has prompted a major disaster declaration for every state, the 5 U.S. territories, and Washington, D.C. FEMA Administrator Pete Gaynor's agency is leading the federal emergency response.
We have a pretty big footprint across the country.
FEMA was assigned the lead role in March, after the pandemic began spreading in the U.S. The agency has been playing catch-up ever since. Some governors have been critical of its efforts to obtain supplies and distribute them. But Gaynor stands by FEMA's coordination between the federal, state, and local levels.
This thing is so immense, it takes whole of America, whole of community to do this.
According to FEMA's latest COVID-19 numbers, the agency has shipped close to 1 billion pieces of protective equipment, like masks, gloves, and gowns, to healthcare workers and first responders. FEMA has also helped community-based testing sites test more than 100,000 people.
To make sure that we understand how widespread the coronavirus is and to get people back to work.
FEMA is also in charge of directing some of the coronavirus relief funds Congress has passed during the pandemic, including money for PPE for fire departments and food for local nonprofits.
We enable those governors to do everything they need to do to protect their citizens.
And as more governors decide to reopen their states, FEMA is also preparing for flooding and hurricane season in the new COVID-19 environment. In Washington, I'm Jessie Tenor.
The vast majority of drugs Americans use come from China. And in the age of coronavirus, many lawmakers say that's a problem.
I think that this is a national security issue.
Anna Eshoo proposed creating a new commission of scientists, doctors, pharmaceutical reps, and defense officials, all to lay the groundwork for manufacturing critical drugs in the U.S.
China wants to make sneakers and T-shirts and all of that. That's one thing. But we should not be dependent on any country for the most critical drugs.
We should never allow China to control supply chains.
Beyond vital drugs, Republican Kevin McCarthy says the U.S. depends too much on China for medical equipment.
This Congress should work on bringing those back to America.
And while it is cheaper to make those generic drugs in India or in China, lawmakers say the security cost is too high to bear, especially during a pandemic. And medical experts say we could change that in just a couple of months.
There is a safety issue when you don't have a diversified supply chain.
Mike Alkire, president of healthcare company Premier Inc., says there are enough American manufacturers to make generic drugs that could treat the virus's symptoms. And he says by fall, the U.S. could maintain enough supply to keep costs competitive.
That would certainly be, I would say, comparative in pricing to what Southeast Asia is offering.
Some lawmakers say funding to manufacture drugs and PPE domestically should be in the next relief package. In Washington, I'm Joe Khalil.
I'd like a better accounting as to who received the money.
Michigan Senator Gary Peters is calling on watchdogs at the Government Accountability Office to investigate who exactly benefited from the billions in small business loans allocated by Congress.
We want to make sure it was spent appropriately.
The first pool of money, $349 billion, was depleted within just 2 weeks. And he says many Michigan small businesses never got a cut.
We're the 10th largest state, and yet we rank 35 in the amount of money coming to small businesses. I think that's unacceptable.
The GAO's office tells me they will review the funding. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has ordered all publicly traded companies to return any money they may have received through the small business loan program. Big names like Shake Shack have already complied. This week, before adding billions more to the loan program, House Democrats like Iowa's Abby Finkenauer passed a plan to create an oversight committee to review all coronavirus spending.
We should be looking at making sure that these are going out in the way that they should.
But no Republicans supported it.
A 9th oversight committee. We have 8.
Illinois' Mike Boss and Kansas Republican Ron Estes say the needed oversight already exists and worry the new committee will be biased.
Basically, it's going to be another impeachment process to say what did the president do wrong.
Already, a special oversight committee created under the CARES Act must review and report spending to Congress within 90 days. In Washington, Raquel Martin.
Clarify your comments about injections
of disinfectant. They're quite
No, I was asking a question sarcastically to reporters like you, just to see what would happen. Now, disinfectant for doing this, maybe on the hands, would work. And I was asking the question of the gentleman who was there yesterday, Bill, because when they say that something will last 3 or 4 hours or 6 hours, but if the sun is out or if they use disinfectant, it goes away in less than a minute. Did you hear about this yesterday? But I was asking a sarcastic and a very sarcastic question to the reporters in the room about disinfectant on the inside. But it does kill it, and it would kill it on the hands, and that would make things much better. That was done in the form of a sarcastic question to the reporters.
So you were asking.
But I do think this, yeah, I do think that disinfectant on the hands could have a very good effect. Now, Bill is going back to check that in the laboratory. You know, it's an amazing laboratory, by the way. It's amazing, the work they do. So he's going to check because a hard surface, this is a hard surface, I guess maybe depending on whose hand you're talking about, right? But this is a hard surface. And disinfectant, the disinfectant has an unbelievable, it wipes it out. You know, you saw it.
But speaking of Mitch, what's gotten into him? Well, it's an indication. The president is asking people to inject Lysol into their lungs, and Mitch is saying that states should go bankrupt. It's a clear, visible, within 24 hours of how the Republicans reject science and reject governance. If you don't believe in science and you don't believe in governance, that's their approach, and we do not. We don't want any more government than we need, but we know that governance has a role, and we know that science has a role. And without science in our decision-making, we are not going to be on a very successful path. I mentioned the president and his, let's say, we can kill the virus by injecting disinfectants like Lysol into the body. Clearly and sadly, the president is not listening to medical experts, and I don't know which ones he is listening to, if any. As I said to my colleague a few days ago, last week, I said America must ignore the lies and start to listen to scientists and others, respected professionals, in order to protect ourselves and our loved ones.
An official from the Department of Homeland Security suggested that UV light, ultraviolet light, and disinfectants can kill the virus on surfaces. That doesn't mean that it is safe internally for people to use those substances or try to get UV light on their bodies. This is very different than killing virus on a surface like a tabletop.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
That has to be shot down very quickly. That's a very, very dangerous thing. Medical people and the manufacturers of Lysol, among others, have said absolutely under no circumstances should people put cleaning substances, bleach, anything like that in your body.
Which I find to be very interesting.
These things are corrosive.
So these are the stickers that we're using here at Salon 13. Basically, they're for checking the guest in and letting all of our service workers know that they're having no problems with any temperature or any type of, what's it called, cough, sneeze, anything like that, any symptoms.
We all want to come back to work. We had a meeting in our parking lot on Tuesday with all the employees, and everyone decided that who wanted to work this weekend, who didn't, who wants to start next week. So that's all been determined, and we're moving forward.
Psalms 37.
Ask Connie Boyd how she's weathered the past few weeks, and she'll point to her faith.
It says, trust in Jehovah and do what is good.
Boyd is one of the 26 million Americans to lose their jobs amid the coronavirus pandemic. Up until last month, she manned a kiosk at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport.
If we're not able to pay our bills, then what's next?
Boyd is not alone. A new poll from the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found 46% of all Americans have experienced some type of income loss in their household.
I would so much rather prefer to just never have to go through like 4 weeks of not knowing where my next meal is coming from, like, ever again.
Jeremy Miller was laid off from his lucrative bartending gig. Unemployment has started coming in, but the bills are still piling up.
It's probably about 50% of what I was making at the Crunkle tent.
45% of Americans expect the economy to rebound over the next year, while 37% believe it will only get worse.
Even though we want to have the perception of things wanting to be better, sometimes it don't work like that.
Both Boyd and Miller are grateful for their stimulus checks, but agree the sum wasn't enough.
Seeing $1,200 deposited in my bank account is never an unwelcome sight, but I think that there's a lot more that could be done.
Miller is one of the 78% of those experiencing a household layoff who expect that job will come back once this blows over. He's eager to get behind the bar again, but when that may be is anyone's guess. Sarah Blake Morgan, The Associated Press.
I had pneumonia, so I didn't know what that was. I didn't know like how severe this was, and I also have a thyroid issue. So I knew that like people with like underlying health medical issues, like it could be really bad for them, this virus.
We're very excited. We got our 600th discharge. COVID has been ravaging the community, and we've been seeing a lot of deaths. So it's good to hear the positive side too, is that a lot of people are going home and back to their lives. At some point you just feel like nothing you do makes a difference, but seeing something like this today, it makes a difference. So what we're doing makes a difference.
The food here wasn't bad, but like I miss my mother's food.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleam, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streamed, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say